been announced that Australia will spend $3.5 billion on a fast-track new defence package, upgrading fighter jets and naval ships with cutting-edge long-range missiles. Experts are warning that this move could indicate the possibility of a major Asia-Pacific power war in the coming years. Joining me to discuss is Senior Analyst in Defence Strategy and Capability for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Malcolm Davis. Malcolm, with such a spike in defence spending and growing hostilities with China, how likely is it that Australia will become involved in a major war?
Look, I think what we're responding to is growing concerns that China will make a move against Taiwan in the second half of this decade. Their military is rapidly modernising with that operation in mind. And it really does depend on how the US administration of the day responds to that scenario. It's more than likely the US would intervene to support Taiwan. And then to paraphrase Minister of Defence Peter Dutton, it's inconceivable that Australia would then sit on the sidelines and let America go into harm's way in that scenario. So I think it's quite possible that we could be facing that contingency in the second half of this decade, and so therefore we need to be ready for it.
Wow, so you've been monitoring China's intentions with Taiwan. You think there is a likelihood that they will do something in the coming years, or is it just a threat that we've got to be aware of? What's the likelihood that they're going to actually invade?
For President Xi Jinping, taking Taiwan, essentially enforcing a unification of Taiwan and China, invading and annexing Taiwan, is essential to his grip on power. And it's essential to what the Chinese call the China dream, which is to reconstitute China as the Middle Kingdom, as the global dominant power. And Taiwan has to be part of China from Xi's perspective. Now, it's really critical to point out that the Taiwanese people do not want that. They do not want reunification with China. They see themselves not as part of China, not as Chinese, but as Taiwanese. But from Xi Jinping's perspective in Beijing, that's unacceptable. So if Taiwan is refusing unification on Beijing's terms in a peaceful sense, then China will probably use force in the second half of this decade.
Oh, that's frightening. There's a lot of military infrastructure in Darwin. Would that make Darwin a possible target if Australia is involved in a US-China conflict? And do we have the capability to defend Darwin if there is an attack?
As you say, Darwin is really, and the north of Australia is becoming really critical. And I think that what we have to be aware of is that both from a perspective of Australian forces operating from the north of Australia, places like Darwin and RAAF Tyndall and other locations, as well as potentially US forces operating from northern Australia, they are likely to come under attack. Chinese long-range missile systems already can hit targets across northern Australia, including Darwin and RAAF Tyndall. So we have to be able to defend those key targets against those sorts of attacks, as well as against cyber attacks, against our critical information infrastructure. And we also have to ensure that our logistics infrastructure, our fuel supplies, our road networks, our communications infrastructure is all protected. So really, what is important is boosting resilience in the north and ensuring that we have resilient capabilities that can support potentially what would be a protracted war in the Indo-Pacific at a very high intensity. What we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment, I think probably would be an order of magnitude smaller in comparison with the prospect of a China-US war over Taiwan.
Wow, so would you expect the US's involvement to be far more dramatic than their support of Ukraine with the Russian invasion? What would that support from the US look like?
Well, look, if the US chooses not to intervene to support Taiwan, then their credibility in the eyes of key partners and allies, including Japan, including South Korea and Australia, would be at risk. And you also have to look at the fact that Taiwan is just one part of the Chinese grand strategy, which is to essentially emerge as the dominant power in the Western Pacific. From Chinese-controlled Taiwan, China could project military force deep into the Central Pacific against Guam and Hawaii. They could project force south into Southeast Asia and the ASEAN states to dominate those militarily. And they could much more easily isolate Japan in terms of a naval and economic blockade. So I think it's in the US interest to intervene in this case because they lose so much strategic credibility and influence if they don't. And if the US intervenes, as I said, going into harm's way in their most greatest test, in their greatest hour of need, I think it's inconceivable that Australia would stand idly by and not support the US.